Hello, it's September 21st, 2020, and this is a flashback. I'd sort of like to go to any century other than the one that I'm in right at the moment, but I'm going back to September 21st, 1938, as it was told to me by my dad. September 21st, 1938 was the worst hurricane my father had ever experienced, and in fact, all of New England had ever experienced. Now, there may have been some other, quote, big blows, but this was really a destructive storm. And way before storms were named or were really able to be predicted. So here's the story that he told me. That he left home in Newton to go down to the Cape House to check on the house because he'd heard there was going to be a bit of a blow, but no big deal. But he wanted to go down and check on the house. His mother was there. I don't know how old at that point. I guess I should have done my homework and checked. But my guess is that she was in her 70s. And she was taking care of one of her grandchildren by the name of Chet, who was about 2 years old. Or 3, I forget exactly. But anyway, he was going down, and he took the route from Newton to Wareham before the big highways. So it was all, a Route 27 or Route 44, maybe Route 152. There weren't any 128, Route 495s, or Route 95 to go to. So it was pretty much all back roads. And then when he came through Onset, which has a lovely harbor and it's sort of on a promontory and elevated a bit, and he rounded the corner and he felt the car sort of be affected by the wind. And since he had grown up in this area, he was able to tell the difference between gale force winds and, hurricane force winds. And that was the first indication he had that this may be more than what they were predicting. Now, the interesting thing to me is that I'm used to 2020 predicting hurricanes following for days ahead of time. There was none of that here. There was just some indication that there was going to be some storminess, some windy storminess. And at the time that my father was driving along Onset Avenue on his way to Buzzards Bay and Butler's Cove, where the house was, New York was experiencing hurricane force winds, but there didn't seem to be a communication system even from New York to Boston, or at least some way of knowing. So it's interesting. That was his first indication. And he went down to the house, and it was clearly beginning to get very, very windy. And so he knew that this was something out of the ordinary. And the house is on the water, set up a bit with some stairs and then some lawn in front of where the house is. And usually in high tide, the water on the fullest tide ever would just come up to half of the seawall, not spill out on the lawn, not do anything like that. And to the right of the house was the driveway, a big circular driveway with grass in between the circle. And when he came down the driveway, he felt again the power of the wind. So anyway, he set about securing the house as best he could. And then night fell, because this was a storm where I believe the bulk of the wind and the damage happened at night. So the howling of the wind and the shuddering of the house and the windows, and this was a big house, it's a well-built house, this is not a small cottage. So he grew increasingly alarmed when he put out a spotlight onto the front lawn that slopes down to the water. And he saw the water was well over the seawall and on its way up the intermediate slope of stairs. Now there was about 12 more feet or 15 more feet to the house, but he had never seen it, the water up this high. And it's night. And this is, I think, historically, they listed it as a Category 4 storm. So we're talking winds in excess of 100 miles per hour. He could not go out of the house in the front of the house without being blown down. So he was in a pickle. And so he was a ham radio operator, so he had this big radio tower in the backyard, which was in the lee part of the house. So he went out and put a stake just in front of the antenna. And he did that because he said to himself, if this water comes up and surrounds and gets to that stake, he and his mother and Chet were going to have to go out the back door in the lee side of the house and go to his brother's home, which was further up a sloping hill. He was not there at the house, I don't believe, but I think my father had a key so he could get in. So, at any rate, a couple of hours go by, he puts the spotlight back out, and the water is now at the steps to the house and on its way up the steps. So he goes to the dining room, which has a whole wall of windows, and he puts the spotlight out, and the water is now parallel with the dining room windows, part of the lawn, and about maybe 8 feet from the stake. So he tells his mother that they're going to have to leave. And she refuses to go. And he was a very quiet man, but when he knew something, and he would try to get you to get on board. So he said, well, be prepared because I'm going to go check in another hour. And if the water is at the stake that I put out there, I am picking you up and taking you out of the house. Picking up Chet was not a problem. He was only 2 or 3 years old. And my grandmother was a petite woman, but I can just imagine the thought of her having to be picked up, which I think he probably would have had to have picked her up anyway. They would have had more weight together dealing with that wind than two of them individually. So anyway, he waited an hour and then put the spotlight out, and the water had begun to recede. It was no longer at the dining room windows. It was about a foot back. So he realized then that the tide had turned. The wind was still howling, but that the tide now was going to be going out. So obviously a big sigh of relief that he didn't have to deal with picking up his mother and Chet. But the next day, he realized that the water had completely filled up the basement. And he had heard noises around the living room floor, and he didn't quite know what the noises were. Well, it turns out that the water had filled up the basement and had started licking the bottom of the living room floor. So literally a foot more of water and the house would have been filling with water. I think my grandmother would have gone then, don't you? Although some people. Anyway, that's a first-hand account from my dad. And the property had on it many pine trees in the circle, as well as along the driveway. And the water had completely surrounded those trees and ultimately killed them, so that all of those trees had to be removed. So that was one of the legacies. When I look back on the photos of the house and the property before 1938, it's just dense with trees. And then any photo after 1938, no trees. All right, that's my flashback. But imagine New York is having hurricane force winds and Boston doesn't know. Wow. You may hate that the weather people are on us every minute when there's a storm in the Gulf or something named just a number, but there are benefits to it.